Okay guys, it's me, Mr. Farrader, and we're going to start talking today about evolution through natural selection. So let's start really quickly with a scale of 1 to 5 rating. What do you already know about evolution? 5 means you ought to be teaching this lesson. 1 means you don't know a whole heck of a lot about it. Okay? Do you have your rating in your mind? My guess is that most of you guys by 8th grade are probably like a 3-ish on evolution. I think you probably have heard the term before and you know some of the basics, but I'm not sure that you know exactly how it happens. And it's an important lesson to pay attention to because it's sometimes controversial. There are people who don't believe that evolution through natural selection has actually happened. And I'm not here to tell you what to believe at all. But what I am here to do is to show you the evidence that scientists use to support the argument that living things have evolved and changed over time. So what I want you to do during the course of these videos and notes is to decide how convincing you think the evidence is. And who knows, maybe by the end of our unit you will say, hey, I don't believe that evolution really happens. And that's perfectly okay as long as you can give me evidence to support your argument. Okay? Or you might say, I actually do believe that evolution through natural selection happens. And here's the evidence that I found to be convincing. The goal here is for me to give you evidence and you to decide what you believe. All right, everybody got that? Great. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I want you to know is that evolution, if I were to give you a simple definition, just means the change in organisms or landforms over time. So let's start with another rating inside of your mind. Do you believe that organisms have changed over time? Scale of 1 to 5. 5 means absolutely I believe that organisms have changed. And 1 means, no, I think that organisms are pretty much the same today as they were, a million years ago. All right, so think about what your rating is for that first. My guess is that most of you probably would argue that you're probably a 4 or 5 on that. You're probably pretty convinced that organisms have changed over time. And the reason for that is because you've probably seen a lot of organisms that were alive a million years ago, and a lot of organisms that are alive today, and they don't look anything alike, do they? So that's what the fundamental definition of evolution is. It's how did those organisms change over time? Okay, it's the study of change over time. All right? And another thing that's worth knowing about evolution is that the fundamental argument, when I say evolution through natural selection, what that means is that animals have developed their unique characteristics in response to the environment around them. So why does a polar bear have a lot of fat and big, thick fur? Well, it's responding to the environment that it lives in. And if it didn't have that big, thick fur or all that fat on its body, it wouldn't survive very well in the Arctic. So the argument of evolution through natural selection is that animals get their unique characteristics because they're adapting to the environment around them. And changes in the environment will have an impact on the animal. Okay, scale of 1 to 5 that. How strongly do you feel that animals and plants are uniquely suited to their environment? Probably a 5 on that too, right? You can give lots of examples. Cactuses hold on to water. Why? Well, they live in a desert, right? Foxes have big bushy tails and they can blow their bodies up with air inside their fur. Why? Because they live in very cold places and they need to keep themselves warm. That's evolution through natural selection. It's adaptation to the unique circumstances of an environment. And then what happens is the species that have the traits that give them the best chance of surviving, well, those buggers are going to survive. And then they're going to reproduce, and then they're going to pass those traits down to their offspring. Similarly, organisms that don't have the traits necessary to survive are going to die before they can reproduce. So the argument is that that change over time happens because some living organisms are uniquely suited to survive, and they will, and they'll pass their traits down to their offspring, and other organisms don't have traits that will allow them to survive, and they're going to die before they produce any offspring. And their unfavorable traits will just disappear into nothingness. Okay, does that make sense to you? Okay, that's what the argument is. When I say evolution through natural selection, what I'm talking about is change in animal species over time as they adapt to their environment and then pass their desirable traits down to their children. Now, don't forget, our goal here is to determine what evidence scientists use to support the theory of evolution through natural selection. Your job is to decide whether you think that evidence is valid or not. So let me show you one type of evidence that scientists use to argue that evolution through natural selection happens. And that bit of evidence is through the biological characteristics of living things. Well, what the heck does biological characteristics means? Well, it means the structures of our bodies. Scientists look at the structures of organisms and they can see hints that evolution through natural selection has happened. Now, one of those structures that they look for is called a homologous structure. And you can see that highlighted on your screen. What that means is if you look at the organs or the skeletons of animals and organisms, oftentimes you'll discover that those organs and skeletons look pretty darn similar. And I'll show you an example in just a second, but the similarities between organs and structures to scientists suggest that maybe those species were related to each other in the way distant past. Maybe 40 or 50 million years ago, there was some kind of overlap between those species. What's the proof of the overlap? Well, they've got strangely similar skeletons today. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand that? Those are called homologous structures, things that are strangely similar between very different species today are hints that they may have been related in the past. The other type of structure is called an analogous structure. And an analogous structure actually appears in two completely different species, but it serves a common purpose. And I'll show you an example of that in a second too. So let's start with those homologous structures. Here is the arm of 5 different creatures, right? Humans and cats and horses and bats and dolphins. If you could see the skeletal bones of the arms of each of those creatures, you would discover some pretty strange similarities. Fundamentally, each of those creatures has fingers. We call those phalanges. Each of those creatures has 2 bones in their lower arm. Each of those creatures has 1 large bone that connects to the equivalent of a shoulder. We call those the humerus. So that's fascinating, isn't it? If you were to look at the arm of a cat, it looks skeletally very similar to the arm of a human. And if you were to look at the arm of a dolphin, skeletally it looks very similar to the arm of a human. So what that suggests to scientists is in the super distant past, there must have been some relationship between these organisms. Now, you may have already picked out what at least one of the relationships is. Those are all mammals, right? So there's no coincidence there to scientists that mammals all have similar skeletal structures. And that's because scientists believe that evolution through natural selection has happened. They believe that there was some shared ancestry in the way back distant past. Now, each of these creatures has developed differently since, right? We're nothing like a horse. We're nothing like a bat or a dolphin. So we certainly have changed over time away from one another, But scientists believe that there must have been at least some similarities between those organisms millions of years ago. Otherwise, you wouldn't see these skeletal similarities that we do. Here's those analogous structures we were talking about, right? Here's a penguin and a fish. Those two guys are not the same species at all. They're not even the same family of species. However, they both have fins that allow them to change direction in water. And so that's an example of an analogous structure. It's a structure that serves a similar purpose that developed in different species. Both species needed to change direction in water, and so they developed similar structures even though they're not related to each other. Sometimes, and that's, remember, go back to that idea of creatures respond in response to their environment. Both those creatures needed the ability to change direction in water, so they developed separately from each other. They developed a very similar structure. That's really cool. That's called an analogous structure. Okay? Now, there's another bit of evidence that I think is shocking for evolution. I can't wait to hear what you think of this. Scientists also believe there's some hints about evolution that can be found in the embryos of living organisms today. Now, do you know what an embryo is? Right, an embryo is the developing version of an organism. It's the unborn developing version of an organism. Right? And if we look at embryos of different organisms today, you will find some shocking similarities, some things that will blow your mind. For example, if you look at a human embryo, a developing baby, it actually has gill slits just like the developing embryo of a fish. You need proof? Well, take a look at this graphic. It shows the developing embryos of several different creatures. And if you look carefully at those graphics, over time, each organism develops into its own unique characteristics, right? We would all agree that humans and fish are not the same. That's not a surprise to us. However, if you go back and look at the early embryonic state, the early embryos of all of those different organisms, they share lots of traits in common. So scientists believe that those similarities in early embryos are more evidence that maybe there was some relationships between those creatures in the distant evolutionary past. I'm not talking about 15 years ago. I'm talking about 15 million years ago. Maybe there was some relationships between those organisms. What's the proof? Well, their embryos are strangely similar. And so that suggests that maybe there was a relationship at some point in the distant past. So what do you think of that evidence? Is that convincing to you? Now remember, it doesn't have to be. You might say, no, that's just a coincidence that the embryos are so darn similar. Okay, but you just have to think about the evidence and decide what it means to you. Okay? Now, the very last bit of biological evidence that we can find for evolution are these things called vestigial structures. How's that for a mouthful, right? That's a vocabulary word I bet you haven't ever seen before. Well, a vestigial structure is an anatomical feature that doesn't seem to have any purpose in the organism that it's inside of. Remember, an anatomical feature means a part of your body that doesn't seem to have any purpose anymore. And so what we think is the vestigial structures maybe were important in our distant evolutionary past, but they're not important to the organism today. And what scientists think is over the course of evolutionary time, those structures aren't used anymore, but they haven't left our bodies either. Now, I know this can sound really confusing, but let me give you a sample. Have you guys ever seen a cat, looked up close at a cat and watched its ears? Cats can do something really incredible with their ears. They literally can turn them almost around. Like, it's nuts. Like, we have 2 cats in our family, and I can, like, whisper from behind one of the cats, and it will literally take its ear and just turn it backwards so that it can hear me. Have you guys seen that before? Scale of 1 to 5. 5 means, yep, I know what you're talking about, Mr. Ferreter. 0 means, nope, cats can't turn their ears backwards. All right, so here's something crazy. Are you ready? This is going to blow your mind. Ready? Well, humans actually have muscles in our ears that used to play that role for us. How crazy is that? And those ear muscles still exist. They're vestigial structures. They're still there in your ear right now. Now, you can't turn your ear around backwards, can you? Yeah, neither can I. Now, how do scientists know that these muscles used to fill the same role for humans? Well, they do these tests where they wire up the side of your head to see how those muscles respond. And then they have people whispering from behind you. And what happens is every time someone whispers behind you, those muscles try to do their job. They try to turn your ear around. Obviously, they can't. That's a vestigial structure. It's a leftover structure that maybe served a purpose for us in our distant evolutionary past. What purpose might it have served? Well, maybe at some point, some early version of a human was able to turn their ears backwards, but that's not important to us anymore. So that structure doesn't serve a purpose. But what that suggests is maybe somewhere in the distant past, there was some overlap between cats and humans. And that's not totally far-fetched, right? Cats are mammals too. Right? So that big idea of mammals, we're one big category of animals with some overlap between us. Doesn't mean that we're cats. That's 100% not true. But maybe there was some relationships between early versions of cats and super early versions of humans. Maybe they sprang out of the same evolutionary tree. Okay? So we're at the end of biological characteristics. Remember, those hints are vestigial structures, things that serve no apparent purpose anymore, but hint at some relationships between animals. We talked about embryological similarities, so our embryos are strangely similar to other organisms, and maybe that's a hint at some evolutionary overlap between species. And then we also talked about analogous structures, so structures that serve the same purpose but developed separately in animals, and homologous structures, or these strange similarities between the skeletons of what appeared to be very different creatures. So of those, is any of them convincing to you? Do any of them make you say, maybe there is some truth to this evolution thing. Maybe there is some truth to the fact that way in the distant past there was some overlap between animals. Like, what do you think about that? All right. Anyways, it's fun to think about, that's for sure. And I'm going to start making the new set of notes for you to show you some different evidence that scientists use to argue in favor of the theory of evolution.